All right, now we get to head into the super fun part, the Esther chapter 6. So for those that are online, there's the comment section that's available within the Facebook pages. Feel free, if you don't have anybody sitting in the room next to you, to engage with the comment section in there. So we're still building that community, even though we're using technology as opposed to just our voices. So I'm going to ask you to, this is now a time to interact with each other and have a conversation. So turn to a neighbor, and Dave would usually start off with, "Hey neighbor."
Hey neighbor.
Relate a time or share a story where you completely misread a situation. And how did you handle it? And I'm going to hop on the Facebook page to see if anybody's on there. I'm only hearing a few giggles and laughs, which means we need to get better stories. All right, does anybody have a story or some highlights of a story they'd like to share? I'm seeing some heads shaking they'll share with the person next to them, they're not going to share with the larger crowd. Oh, Kelly's more than willing to share Jolene's story, I think, is what I'm seeing over there.
Every time I have ever asked a girl out on a date.
So Kelly is relating to his experiences before Jolene, that he apparently misread the situation every time he asked some girl out on a date. And so I think most guys can relate to that one, where they completely misread the situation and either were embarrassed or pleasantly surprised, or for some may have dodged a bullet. So anybody else have another story they want to relate to it? All right, I do see a couple people online, so feel free to interact online. Right, so what I love about the book of Esther is it unfolds like a TV docuseries or drama, where one of those epic, each chapter is about another episode of what's happening in the book of Esther. So I'm going to do a little bit of a recap. So previously seen on Esther, the king throws a dazzling feast, but cracks appear when Queen Vashti defies him. So that was chapter 1. Esther, a young Jewish woman raised by her cousin Mordecai, emerges from the shadows, wins the beauty contest. Beautiful and strong, she navigates a court filled with both luxury and danger. Mordecai, her advisor and confidant, reminds her, "Who knows if you have not come to royal position for such a time as this?" Which tends to be the most famous verse out of Esther, being prepared for such time as this. Mordecai uncovers a plot to assassinate the king. Loyal to his adopted land, he discreetly informs Esther, who in turn reveals the plot, saving the king's life. A new villain enters the scene. Haman, the arrogant advisor. Consumed by pride, when Mordecai, steadfast in his faith, refuses to bow, Haman's fury ignites a plot to destroy all the Jews, including Esther. Esther, an outsider, finds herself with a potential voice. Mordecai, unwavering in his faith, becomes a silent guardian. Haman, blinded by ambition, sets a sinister plan in motion. Which brings us to this episode. A tale of two reversals. Esther 6, verses 1 through 6. That night the king could not sleep. So he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. So how many of you have ever had a tough time sleeping? And you go back to the time when you were 3, 4, 5. So my grandkids right now are 4 and 2. And every night, before they go to bed, they've got to have stories. They got to have stories. I think that's one of those things that we do as grown-ups, or mostly grown-ups for those of us who have yet to decide to grow up, that, let's get something in our minds that slows our minds down and allows us to focus on something, and then we can fall asleep, to get the soothing voice of someone who loves us or someone who cares for us to read to us. So the king was doing the same thing. Normal, everyday dude, can't sleep. Oh wait, not normal everyday, because he's a king. And his bedtime stories are stories about himself. So he asked, hey, let's go and have the Chronicles read to me. So they come in and read the Chronicles. It was recorded there that Mordecai had exposed, and I always have a tough time with these words, but I always think of the WWE or the WWF with names like Big Thana or Teresh. It's like a duo on the tag team wrestling circuit. 2 of the king's officers who guarded the doorway had conspired to assassinate the king. What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? The king asked. The attendants answered, nothing. We've done nothing for him. The king said, who is at the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on the pole he had set up for him. His attendants answered, Haman is standing in the court. Bring him in, the king ordered. When Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought to himself, who is there that the king would like to honor rather than me? So if we go back to last week in chapter 5, this is where Esther had started laying out the plan of how to save the Jews. She asked the king, hey, let's do a dinner. I'll cook. We'll have this great feast, but I only want 2 guests, you and Haman. So Haman was showing up early, because the last thing you want to do is be late for a party for the queen and the king. So that's what brings Haman there, and why he's got this perception that, oh, this is going to be spectacular. So the chapter opens up with a seemingly mundane detail: the king can't sleep. But as we often learn that these small things in these stories end up being rather significant. This sleepless night becomes the catalyst for a major shift in events. The king, unable to rest, calls for the Chronicles to be read. And that refers back to Esther 6:1, chapter 1, where he's going, Imagine being buried in these records and finding the one story of Mordecai. That's the one that gets read. At the time when Haman is planning to kill the Jews because Mordecai refuses to bow to him. A small act of speaking up that Mordecai did was honored for it, or was credited with saving the king, has potential life-altering events down the road. This whole piece was hanging out, listening, and speaking up because it was the right thing to do. And then convincing Esther to speak up because it was the right thing to do. So it reminds us of some of the pieces in Ephesus, or the Ephesians, the book of Ephesians, where we're called to be completely humble and gentle, be patient, bearing with one another, in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Even the smallest act of kindness, the smallest display of loyalty, can contribute to a greater good, fostering unity and peace within the community. And remember, this isn't the Jewish community. This is a time when the Jews are in exile. They're in Persia. They have been taken away from their homeland, from the land that was promised to them. So as we move on to the king remembering Mordecai's bravery, he asks, what honor or recognition has been bestowed on Mordecai? So we see that the king values loyalty and wants to see it rewarded, which is kind of a stark contrast to Haman, who craves recognition for himself. So the king is now saying, oh, we didn't honor him. Now we should honor him. We missed that. Trying to correct an error that the king had made. And so the king himself wants to honor Mordecai. And Haman came to get more recognition for himself. Focused on himself. Focused on how he can get more recognition. Which is a stark contrast to how Mordecai has presented himself. Haman, blinded by his pride, is about to experience the reversal of his own. Now it's back to you guys. Has there been a time when things took a hilarious or unexpected turn? Let's share some of those stories. Good intentions paved the way for chaos. You tried to help but made it worse, or your preparation backfired spectacularly, opposite of the intended result. I'm sure, with the amount of years of experience we have sitting in here right now, that there's got to be at least one or two stories that you're able to share with someone next to you. Ready, engage. All right, anybody have a story that they're willing to share that I'm able to repeat? Russ has one, or Weston volunteered Russ is what it sounded like over there.
So I got a really good deal on a van to take a bunch of scouts up to South Dakota. They only charged us $678 for the entire week. As it would turn out, the van didn't have air conditioning and no spare tire. And we actually blew up the tire and we tried to get the tire replaced. And
That's great. So Russ shared a story when he was scoutmaster, taking a bunch of scouts up to South Dakota, found a great deal on a van to get them back and forth to South Dakota, but there was no air conditioning and no spare tire.
Full 15 passenger van.
Full 15 passenger van, which means you probably had about 18 to 20 scouts in there with all their gear. And so they ended up getting a flat tire with no spare, tried to get a repair, but the fortunate side of this story is that the camp they were going to had the exact same make and model of van and were able to borrow their spare tire. We'll say borrow, rather than use the spare tire for the rest of to get back home. That's a good story. Probably not the same thing that Haman ended up happening, but we'll find out. So Haman answered the king, "For the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on his head. And let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.'" So, I love the irony that continues in this and how blinded by his arrogance that Haman is behaving. Haman, bringing that arrogance, envisions a grand display to honor himself, planned his own party. He outlines a lavish ceremony, picturing himself adorned in the royal garments and paraded through the city. However, as it can foreshadow that in Matthew, Christ tells us that whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. Great lesson here. Too bad that Haman was here before he had Matthew, the book of Matthew, to learn from. But this points back to how the book in the Old Testament is teaching us and is a great tool to learn how to behave in a modern Christian world. This verse applies perfectly to Haman. Unaware of the king's intentions, Haman excitedly agrees to this plan, not realizing it's for Mordecai and not himself. The irony is delicious. Haman, the architect of Mordecai's demise, becomes the one paraded through the streets, parading Mordecai through the streets, forced to honor the very man that he sought to destroy. The tables are turned, a reminder that pride often precedes the fall. Continuing on in verse 10, "Go at once," the king commanded Haman. "Get the robe and the horse and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended." So Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." And if we want to circle back, Haman is essentially second in charge in the entire kingdom. Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief and told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, "Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started," how many times have we noticed that our wives are way more perceptive than we are? I will say most of the time. Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin. You cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. There's another wife, also mentioned in Matthew, talking to her husband, and it's the wife of Pilate. And Pilate's wife tells him, "This man is innocent." You should not do any punishment to him. And I often wonder as I go through these and go, man, God gives us opportunities to listen to those around us, to do what is right. And we contrast that to Mordecai and Esther doing what is right. Esther listening to Mordecai and telling the king, listening and paying attention to doing what is right, as opposed to what lurks and what evil lurks in the hearts of men. For those who watched The Shadow in the 50s and 60s, who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The Shadow knows. Sorry, that was a comic book TV show from long, long ago. But the advice of his wife and the advice of Pilate's wife on how things could have been different for each of those men. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. And that brings us to the close of this episode. The story of Esther 6 reminds us that pride and self-promotion do not provide fulfillment. As we look at that, these pieces that Haman was trying to do and make himself feel better, even though there are opportunities for him to feel better about himself, isn't the way to get fulfillment. It's through Christ, through Christ's model of humility, of being humble, of service, trusting in God's plan. Just as Mordecai's loyalty was rewarded unexpectedly, so too are we often offered the ultimate reward of salvation through Christ. Unexpectedly rewarded. Let us strive to follow Christ's example, living in humility and trusting in God, in his unseen hand that guides us towards salvation. Let us listen to those who God has put in our path, to be an encouragement, to remind us to be humble, to remind us to be encouraging of one another. Lord, as we come and listen to this snippet, this single episode of Esther, let us recognize that we often put ourselves in Haman's shoes instead of Mordecai's shoes. We take the opportunity to exalt ourselves, that we feel an internal need and desire to do something better for ourselves as opposed to following the humility and example of Christ. Amen. All right, tune in next week. The tables have turned with a satisfying thud. Haman, the architect of Mordecai's demise, is forced to orchestrate his own rival's triumph. Humiliated and seething, he leads Mordecai through the streets, cheers the crowd a mockery of his shattered plans. But Haman isn't done yet. A venomous plan coils in his heart. A desperate gamble to salvage his position and eliminate the Jews. Will Esther's courage hold up in the face of Haman's fury? Will the queen find a way to expose his treachery and secure the future for her people? Tune in next week as the stakes rise even higher in the book of Esther.